Alrighty, so I think we can get slowly started. And it's so wonderful to have you guys all here on a fine, what is today, a Saturday morning or a Saturday afternoon, depending on where you are, or a night for our attendees across the world too. My name is Chinmayi Balusu, and I'm going to be hosting this workshop on tech and neuroscience intersections. So we're getting super interdisciplinary today. And I just want to put up front that this is not going to be, very heavy in jargon or technical aspects or much, but more of a broad overview. And I'll personally acknowledge, I only really started learning about tech earlier this year or earlier last year, 2020. Forget we're in 2021. But I definitely think, it's a great way to start thinking about kind of the tech perspective, how we can draw neuroscience concepts in. So regardless of if you consider yourself, in tech and neuro or kind of outside intersections as well, please don't feel intimidated by any means. It's going to be a great time. So let's get started. A little bit about me, because we're going to be spending some time together today. My name is Chinmayi, as I mentioned, and I'm currently a second-year undergrad majoring in hopefully neuroscience and medical humanities. I attend Columbia University, which is in New York City, though I am Zooming into classes right now from home in Northern California. I'm also really passionate about neuroscience, as you can probably tell, specifically brain injury, neurodegeneration. So if you think of neurodegeneration, an example might be researching diseases and illnesses like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Also interested in a little bit of cognitive neuroscience, specifically in memory and attention. And I kind of extend my interest in neuroscience broader through an interdisciplinary perspective, as I mentioned earlier, through my work with the nonprofit Simply Neuroscience, which, as the description states here, we're all about expanding neuroscience education for folks, especially young folks around our age, really strengthening the early pipeline in education specific to neuro. Other interests of mine include healthcare a little bit, public speaking a little bit. Science communication is something that I'm getting more interested in, especially in the course of the pandemic. That's kind of what I've been interested in exploring more. And last but not least, women in STEM advocacy and building these inclusive spaces in the field. So moving on, enough about me. This is a very brief overview of our table of contents. So our trajectory is going to go from talking more briefly about interdisciplinary STEM, kind of setting up the stage for why it's important to think about these two fields in tandem. Then we're going to give a very brief, chat about neuroscience in 101 introduction, nothing too advanced, and you're not going to be quizzed on this afterwards, so don't worry. And this is going to give you a little bit of context to understand what exactly our current day neuro and tech innovations focusing on. And then we will be learning about a super cool example that's in the news often. And after that, we'll be discussing some big questions, so ethics and beyond. Then we'll be talking about steps more relevant to us at our current stage right now. As in ideating, how do we really implement these principles into our own work at the moment? And what do next steps look like for us in the rest of school, college, career, and beyond? And if you guys have questions at any point along the way, please feel free to drop them into the chat, and our lovely workshop helpers like Dia will be here to, make sure your questions are answered. And overall, if you need any help as well, please feel free to drop that in the chat. We're also going to have some question periods, at the end and also in the middle. We'll be taking a short water break just to stretch our legs. So any questions along the way or in the middle, happy to chat. Even if you have comments, anything you want to share that you've personally heard about, feel free to go about doing so. I want to make this as interactive as possible, not just me lecturing on and on. So first question for you guys is, when you hear interdisciplinary STEM thrown out to you, and I know it's thrown around a lot, there's a lot of push towards multidisciplinary thinking, what comes to mind for you? Do you find yourself personally involved in any of these kind of intersections in your own interests? And what does it matter to you personally, or maybe what do you think matters on a broad level? Why is it important for us to think about these intersections? And it doesn't have to be specifically neuro and tech. It can be broader. Maybe take a quick minute to drop a thought in the chat if you'd like. Mon says drawing on different distinct fields in order to solve a common problem in creative ways. That's great. Alexander, I'm mostly associated with biology and using tech to improve people's lives, mainly through machine learning, image recognition, etc. Those are really great. Yeah, I think, Iman, you really hit kind of the core point of the definition. And Alexander, I think that's a really wonderful example of especially in bio and tech. One of the definitely the big pushes about interdisciplinary STEM, and I'm going to move on to next info on the slide, is the collaboration aspect. This is a quote that talks about, none of us can really accomplish science or STEM in these issues alone, and collaboration is the cornerstone. When it comes to including different perspectives in our coursework and overall just pushing the boundaries of just even bio on its own, tech on its own, learning to push outside those boundaries. Julia says, yeah, how we can collaborate to make something brilliant, exactly. Merging our expertise within different fields is essential to kind of those bigger, more inclusive issues, because I think one-sided perspectives, as we kind of have understood over the years, never really work unless we put different teams and made up of those different vantage points together. And kind of something more relevant to us, this quote, interdisciplinary thinking helps us become better critical thinkers, be more self-aware, and grow more confident. Because I think sometimes, imagine, if you walk into a room and you are a biology major, let's say, and you're walking into a room full of computer scientists. Now, it's going to be a little bit intimidating when you don't have any sort of exposure whatsoever to that realm, because they're probably going to be throwing around jargon. For instance, I read about this, found this example the other day where it was like a cell means something different in biology and computer science and engineering, for example. So terminology and jargon can definitely get in the way in terms of formulating these conversations and establishing these collaborative atmospheres. Some other challenges that we face are that when it comes to universities especially, everyone likes to segment and structure things, right? You probably noticed that sometimes maybe you have these courses that are taught by, let's say, the physics department, or maybe not physics, no offense to physics, maybe the computer science department. And you also realize that it could technically be a collaboration with the neuro and the CS departments. Now, is it always super open to anyone outside of those? Maybe not, right? Because there's challenges with the advanced levels, as we mentioned. People need some base intro level knowledge to be able to further on into those advanced courseworks. So that's kind of one of the issues in terms of if you're a neuro major in college, for instance, you're probably going to be pretty constricted to maybe a little bit of neuro, maybe a little bit wandering into psych and CS, but it's difficult to push outside of those boundaries. And another reason why people like structure, especially university settings and research institutions, for instance, even when it comes to startups, people like to have your ideas and your work fall into one category. It's a lot more straightforward when it comes to funding for things that check one box rather than things that are broad and check multiple boxes. So that's one of the big issues in terms of the lack of funding, because interdisciplinary research, scientists who are involved in it behind the scenes when they're applying for these grants, the big question is always, what category do I fall into best? And the answer sometimes is when you're 50-50, there's really no great way to go. So when it comes to, the grant reviewer's perspective, the way that the system is currently set up is that if you are a biology granting institution, or can't think of the word, but if you're granting biology funds primarily, and this project comes in that's half physics, half CS, half ethics, fits your norm of biology research best, rather than this project that seems relatively more over the place outside of biology, which is a big challenge for us, right? Because when it comes to trickling down to where we currently are and exploring as interests, our interests as students, it's difficult to kind of be able to push outside those boundaries and get to explore, okay, this is bio research, but beyond that, what is there? So definitely some big issues in terms of how we approach interdisciplinary STEM, right? It's very exciting, and there's definitely a strong push that there's also challenges along the way. And I don't think it would be proper to kind of talk about what is out there, what is the possibilities, and get inspired from one another without also talking about kind of the behind the scenes, what is something to keep in mind. So this is not to say that, however, you should not push the bounds and try and pursue these kinds of interests, but more of the reality we need to change through hopefully our work in the future as we enter the workforce and beyond. So with that being said, neuroscience, I love it. As you can tell, I'm very biased. And it's absolutely interdisciplinary. And I can name some examples for you. But first, I want to hear your thoughts about what comes to mind when you first think of neuroscience, because it's broad. So what do you first think of? Just as a basic example, I think of like social psychology, like interactions in groups and peers. What comes to mind when you think of neuroscience? And while you think, take a look at this quote here from Francis Crick about how the brain, our entire view of the universe depends on it. And one of the cool things is that neuroscience can be considered, the brain is considered to be one of the most complex objects in the universe, as in, isn't that crazy? Adhd also had this example before, sorry I missed it. Neural networks based on the brain. Yeah, neuro and AI too. A brain who wants to learn more about itself. Yeah, that's always kind of neat to think about. How the brain works, yeah. Does anyone know, don't go to Google right now, does anyone know kind of what the dictionary, quote unquote, definition of neuroscience is? I think we all understand it's like the brain, but anyone know, don't look it up, what kind of the dictionary definition is? Neurochemistry, yeah. How does chemical signaling work in the brain? There's a lot. I think we all think there's blood in the brain, but there's a lot more than that. There are a lot of chemical interactions too. Oh, that's a great one. The study of the brain and its physiology and processes, that's pretty close to perfect. I've also heard other definitions where the study of brain and behavior, so processes you can think of. Another interesting thing is we oftentimes think neuroscience and we think brain, right? Something that's cool to think about though is the spinal cord is also part of the nervous system. And the nerves throughout your body, your reflexes, for instance, if you touch something hot and your finger, recoils basically, those are all built-in reflexes through your spinal cord. All of that too is technically still your nervous system. And one cool thing about neurosurgery is, how neurosurgeons, we think they're brain surgeons, they're also just as much spinal surgeons. The more you know. So a lot of neurosurgeons also do spine surgeries, but Iman, that's a great definition there. And moving on to some very broad information to set the scene. So of course, the brain is the nerve center of our body, and it's made of these billions and billions of cells called neurons. And like you said, neurons that fire together, wire together. There's exactly that. There's a lot of communication going on between neurons. So what these neurons are doing, and I'm going to show you a picture soon of what they look like and how they communicate, but they basically take in information from the outside world and they process it. And they also take kind of what our body wants to do and execute it through controlling our movements, are we looking, things like that. So it's definitely programming responses, both in terms of our more what's called executive functioning, so thoughts, emotions, memories. They're run through, if you think of, there's the frontal lobe right here, which runs a lot of those what's called higher order functioning. And also a lot of our conscious and unconscious movements. I mentioned the reflexes, right? If you touch something hot, like a candle, don't touch candles, or like you accidentally hit a nail or something sharp, those reflexes are also built in. Cool thing is, I was mentioning that they're built into the spinal cord. By the time that you've actually recoiled your finger for most people, your brain actually hasn't processed that yet, but the processing comes a little bit after you recoil, which is kind of cool to think about. And last part about the overall brain, structural wise, the brain is actually split into regions that are specialized for specific tasks and abilities. So I mentioned the frontal lobe, which is kind of at the front part of your forehead here a little bit. That's more with higher order thinking. There's like the occipital lobe at the back of your skull, which is more connected with visual, so seeing. Definitely a lot of language areas are specialized in Broca's and Wernicke's area. You're not being quizzed on this. So overall, what's important to remember is the brain isn't just, there is not neurons firing around haywire, going everywhere, communicating with every single one for every single thing. There's a lot of Coordination, of course, if you are seeing something and then you want to reach towards grabbing an apple, for instance, that requires motor movement connected to visual, but it definitely, isn't going all over the place. That's something to keep in mind. And then all about neurons. We're going to talk more about neurons, those itty-bitty cells that are running throughout the brain, and they're doing so much work for us. We love neurons. And there's about 86 billion of them in the brain. Crazy. That's a crazy number. And they're communicating through electrical and chemical signals, and that's the whole base of their interneuron to neuron communication. So basically how that works is, let's say you see stimuli, you process stimuli. What stimuli can it be? It could be seeing a bird outside my window right now, actually. So I see that bird. That's sensory information, right? It's connected to my senses. Vision is a sense. And it's converted into electrical signals. And these electrical signals are called action potentials. And what these good old action potentials do is they jump along and along and along from neuron to neuron to neuron. And the places at which they jump from neuron to neuron are called these synapses. So they're going to pass over at the synapses. And I'm going to show you a picture. Now, as these electrical signals go along and along, these action potentials trigger different movements to happen. For instance, muscles can contract and move. And one of the things to keep in mind is neuronal communication is not always speedy. It's not always perfect. It's not always in optimal condition. So exercise, stress, alcohol, drug use, lack of sleep, everything can affect neuronal communication. So it's something that is not necessarily set. It can vary for sure. And at the end of the day, though, all of our thoughts and behaviors are going to come from these signals passing along from neuron to neuron in a different variety of combinations. So here's the final reveal of the pretty looking neurons. Let's see. So this, you see the yellow, looks like a little yellow circle with kind of strings coming out of it. That's the cell body, so it's kind of the headquarters of the neuron. And those little yellow strings that you see, that's where the information comes in. And you see something labeled the axon there. It looks like it's a white chain with kind of little bubbles. That's the axon along which the electrical signal gets transmitted. And you see it's connecting with another neuron over there. So neurons are great friends. They like to communicate a lot. And they mentioned earlier that neurons that fire together wire together. Kind of one of the things we see in learning, for instance, is that as a lot of these patterns get stimulated repeatedly for certain triggers, certain stimuli, they start to kind of, those patterns, they get used to it in a sense. And that's a very, very small explanation. It's much more complex than that. But something to keep in mind is, neurons are very flexible in many senses and also pretty steadfast in many senses. So there's a lot of kind of exploration going on around our good old neuron friends. Now, we're going to start getting into the actual, how is this basic knowledge going to translate into the tech world? But before that, I'm curious to see, are you guys familiar with any sort of news that you've heard about tech that is linked to neuroscience? Or have you kind of thought about general ones? Maybe you don't know the names of the products. That's me, I forget the names too sometimes. But can you name any of these current examples that you see in the news maybe, or in startups or beyond? Take a quick minute to think about that. And I mentioned that we're going to be focusing on one big example. Oh, is it Neuralink? A brain diary thing on the news recently. Interesting. So a lot of, I think, what we see, mind reading and kind of translating that. I don't know if telekinesis is telekinesis is something that people are trying to work out. Moving things directly without communication, rather like things can move, directly communicating from your brain. Wink, wink, Neuralink. That rhymed. More cognitive science, but AIs. AIs are definitely very big as well, for sure. Yeah. Well, if you guys have any thoughts coming in along the way too, feel free to keep them coming in the chat. So very, very brief, 3-4 terms of definitions before we get into the example. First is, there's this whole string here, there's a long line of text. And what I meant by that is there are these direct communications between a brain and a computer / machine / device. That's a big focus in neurotech right now. So Neurotechnology, Neurotech, I'll be using that around. And it's based around transmitted signals from your brain. So these projects, these products are called either brain-machine interfaces, brain-computer interfaces. There's these 3 other names listed here. And most commonly, I hear them be referred to as BMIs or BCIs. I tend to prefer BCIs, brain-computer interfaces. And what they do is they're devices that are allowing the user, so a person like us, to communicate with the computer through just brain activity, right? And this is usually measured by EEGs, and what EEGs are, very long name, electroencephalography. And what that does, it's a way to record the electrical activity that the brain is producing through these electrodes, these little stickers that are placed on top of the head, and they read to a machine. So we were talking about, what is the electrical activity, you might ask? Remember those neuron-to-neuron communications? EEGs basically pick up on that on a broader scale. And then you basically get readouts of what the EEG tells you. Might see them in a lot of movies. I have a picture here. But that's kind of what the base of BCIs is, especially. It's based on measuring electrical activity, picking up on that, and trying to control, devices without necessarily, you don't have to type into your computer. You don't have to go press things on your computer with your fingers, but rather your brain would feed that directly to the computer. So, oh my gosh, would you look at that? It's Neuralink. Alexandra, you were spot on. So we're going to look at Neuralink as an example of a BCI because, first of all, it's very talked about in the news. It's kind of one of the most closely followed examples that we see, so there's a lot of information and awareness about it. And I think this video in particular does a really great job of kind of an introduction to what Neuralink is currently trying to do. And then afterwards, we're going to have a small discussion. There's a second little half of this video, just a few minutes. And then we're going to take a water break is what's going to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and start playing this video. Hopefully it shall work. Let us see.
All this last month.
Can you guys hear that okay? I'm going to pause to make sure. All good. Cool.
Gave a presentation for his brain interfacing company, Neuralink. I think it was showing two kids.
This is how you know it's a live demo.
Musk was showing off progress on a device that listens in on electrical signals from the brain and could use those signals to control computers. The tech itself isn't new, but Neuralink wants to make the system smaller, safer, and easier to insert. And if that goes well, the company has a host of bigger goals.
Depression, addiction, strokes, brain damage. These can all be solved with practical Neuralink.
Okay, so this all sounds great, but is this actually possible? Smaller and more streamlined devices are one thing.
Oh, is it being choppy? That's no fun. Yes, thank you, Taya. Yeah, here's a video link as well in the chat from Daya. Let's see if the audio is being choppy. Maybe I can just walk through some images in the video and it should give you an idea kind of what it entails. So basically, I might put it on mute and then just kind of walk you through. So Elon Musk, of course, has been making these presentations about how these individual threads are being put into patients' brains. And they're actually being implanted with surgery. There's little size coin that they talked about, little threads that are put in directly to the skull. So it's a little bit scary, it's surgery. And Gertrude the pig apparently got this surgery. And so those beats that are on the graph there are these changes in electrical activity that are from Gertrude the pig's brain. So whenever she touches something that sends out these neural spikes, these hits of activity, it's detected. But here's the thing that the video talks about. Gertrude's kind of work with animals, and there's a caption coming up here. So we already know kind of that moods and actions are determined by neurons, and it all comes down to, these electrical activity pulses, and we relatively know about this overall brain map of kind of where this electrical activity goes into specifically. Right, we spoke about the specialized areas. Some areas are active when it comes to movement, some areas are active when it comes to vision. So we kind of already know that. And I guess a way to think about Gertrude the pig's kind of experiment was that, hey, this works. It's a starting step. So she has an implant now, and it kind of tells you about what's going on in Gertrude the pig's brain. So yeah, motor function and senses are controlled. And there's also this cool graph coming up where you can see her movements are predicted by the brain activity that's showing up on the graph. So they say it's almost exactly aligned, and the recorded signals in Gertrude's brain are pretty close to what was being detected. And scientists, this is not the first time that scientists have been tracking different activity impulses and behaviors, predicting that based on brain signals in animals. That's been in the field for a while. Let's see. So a previous study taught monkeys to control a robot using a device implanted in their brains. And a study in 2006 used a brain-computer interface to allow folks who were paralyzed to be able to control computers directly with their mind. That's one example of a solution we're going to be talking about in terms of better accessibility for individuals with disabilities. And one of the big issues that folks have with Neuralink so far is that how much of this is actually kind of new brain science? It's still in the very early stages, of course, right? We got to acknowledge it takes a lot of time. However, things related to mapping out electrical activity in animals and how much that predicts their behaviors and actually that we see has been around. It's been around for a while. So the Neuralink threads that they're using to connect the brain are an improvement over these spikes that have previously been used in systems. So coming to like the actual implantation part, it's a lot more effective and safe, I would say, and more, it transmits a lot more information more effectively. It's not clunky, as they say. So Musk says the first human trials will be in patients with spinal cord injuries. Let's see, what else is there? But again, like I mentioned very briefly at the start of the video, Musk really wants to go very far. So memory loss, hearing loss, blindness, seizures, brain damage, addiction, anxiety. There's so many, different aspects that he wants to help solve. It's actually kind of funny here. Musk references Black Mirror at this part, I believe. So he's looking for this kind of a good AI symbiosis, and we're going to be talking about this. So he really wants to be able to integrate the brain, of course, with these machines super flawlessly, that symbiosis part. And that's all with one little coin, as they say, and it's similar to LASIK eye surgery, if you guys are familiar. And this is where he references Black Mirror. But this video, again, kind of starts to caution here is that it's difficult to achieve these ideas just based on expanding more electrodes and putting more fancier electrical kind of things to the test, because the last thing that she said on the caption there was that this is not just a tech problem. And there is a little more in the video after this, but I kind of want to get our discussion ramped up based on that in terms of why is it just a tech problem? What does she mean by that? So kind of here are three questions to guide our thinking a little bit here. In terms of first, feasibility. Do you think, Neuralink is still in the works, right? But do you think that Neuralink would be able to treat such a wide variety of conditions that were on the slide in the future? And then the second question is the ethics, right? You're going to require surgery, and this is, of course, optional surgery, right? It's not something that's going to be life-saving. This is something that people are going to go into the OR, the operating room, to pay and get surgery for a cool device. So what do you think about that? And then again, the part that Musk mentioned about AI symbiosis, complete integration with AI and the human body. What do you think about that? Well, the last part, the disparities. Neuralink is, of course, not the first. There has been a long line of different startups that are working on neurotech products. But the question is, will Neuralink be an equitable product for everyone? And who are the individuals that are going to be prioritized? Now, Musk had mentioned he previously worked with individuals who, well, he did not previously. Previous studies worked with individuals who are paralyzed, so maybe individuals who couldn't move their limbs. So direct communication with the mind, for instance, would allow them to gain that sense of independence, be able to control these devices. He also mentioned spinal cord injury patients, so individuals who are probably, again, with limited motor function for their limbs, would be, would have access to kind of test out the Neuralink options first. But beyond that, even in medicine, even with the general public, do you think it's going to go out to the general public? When, how, who's going to be prioritized? So a lot of big questions there to think about. If you want to tackle one maybe, or either of them, you can kind of jot down bullet points, however you like. Would love to hear what you guys think about that. So Dexter says, I think it's feasible given lots of time and further advances in tech. I know we still don't know too much about the brain. That's absolutely true. One of the big issues is that I kind of am getting a little bit ahead, foreshadowing for the video here, but neuroscience is still itself evolving. And so if you think about it, neuroscientists are first just trying to understand the brain how it is, right? But then neurotech, Neuralink is trying to take that one step further and take the existing knowledge and take it to the next level, right? But kind of, it's a little bit of getting ahead of yourself in some ways, because Neuralink's definitely trying to push the pace and they're trying to get everything together. But at the end of the day, if we just don't have that general knowledge about what the brain is up to still, then what use is it trying to figure out going from zero in some ways? Yeah, of course, Dexter, like you said, the brain is so complex, so it's understandable where we are now. That's absolutely true. We're still even at the most surface level. For instance, the hippocampus is one part of the brain that until maybe last couple of decades, people thought it was mostly just memory processing, storage, and all of that. But the hippocampus is also implicated in a lot of other functioning, like attention, for instance. And it's kind of, we're always revising our definitions of an understanding of what parts of the brain are doing. So it's super in the works. And it's kind of the pace of trying to create this innovative tech versus just at the end of the day, just try to understand what our brains are up to is a balance in its own. Jenna, but if it does manage to solve problems like addiction or depression, it could be life-saving. That's absolutely true. And that's kind of one of the reasons that people are trying to push, right? Is that, hey, if we can get this sort of innovation rolling right about now, even if it's not, super big results coming out of it, it's still a step in the right direction. Jay says, I'm sure a lot of people are scared of having a high reliance on tech in their lives, but I think it can improve the lives of many with neurological disorders. Absolutely. And kind of I guess one of the things, if you guys think about, I guess question-wise, I'll frame you as a comment. Do you guys think it's right to present this maybe still in the works product, we're not sure how effective it is, to individuals with spinal cord injuries first? Do you think that's right from like a medical perspective, as in, okay, these individuals may have a shot at this, so I think it's worth it to try, but also is it kind of like, in a weird way, making guinea pigs out of us? What do you guys think about that? Because I'm a little bit iffy about that too, personally. I'm like, I don't really, translation between pigs and humans, first of all, is going to be really big. Pigs and rodents and humans, there's big gaps. But then also it's kind of like, who are the first individuals to test it out? Surgery, I think, is fine, but the line between what a human is after this integration becomes fuzzy. He talked about AI doing computations connecting to the internet in the future, I think. Yeah, that AI symbiosis concept, this video briefly touched upon that. But it's kind of like, you're going to be fully connected to the web in some ways. Like everything is going to be integrated. We're not going to have Alexas anymore. It's just going to be you and your brain and this AI and such. Yeah. So back to that question about consent, spinal cord injuries. I think if that's a last resort and if the person consents to it, then perhaps so, but I'm a bit iffy as well. I agree with that. I like to see more information on why they chose spinal cord injuries. If a patient is willing to act as volunteers, then it's okay. Of course, the concept of informed consent, and it seems like these people that they're recruiting as, potential human trial participants, they're maybe, consenting. Of course, I don't think any of us are experts on spinal cord injuries, but it seems like, I think Dea mentioned this before too, considering that they're probably already going through, I'm gonna plug in my laptop really quick, sorry. Considering these folks are already probably going and other sorts of procedures to try to retain some normal function, it's like, is this some sort of hope? But then again, the whole issue of informed consent is, do the benefits outweigh the costs and the potential risks? And we don't know that So ethically, I'm not a big fan of human experimentation until they know it won't cause any harm. But if they consent to it, then it's okay. Yeah. I can't think of the specific name of this clinical trial once, but it just ended up in they administered a drug to a group of patients, and it went very downhill. I think there's YouTube videos explaining what it was if you just search up like human participant trial disasters. And they talk about, how these patients were perfectly healthy and they did not realize that such adverse effects could happen. And that's just talking about a drug. And this is completely uncharted territory in many ways. So the ethical questions definitely are really big. And I just wanted to highlight the ethical part of surgery as well, because let's say one day this comes to the general public. Is it going to be used for military purposes? Is it just going to be reserved for that? Is it going to be like the new face recognition technology, but now you can just unlock your phone by thinking about it? Because one of Neuralink's big pushes is to connect your devices and your laptops and et cetera to just the first start of connecting that with your thinking and just controlling that with your mind control. But I think one of my personal worries is that big data taken to a whole other level. Yeah, really escalating that. I think one of my worries is that considering it's surgical implantation and it is elective, a lot of folks are not going to be able to access that if the cost, insurance comes in the way. It's not like a mandatory needed procedure. So are people going to have some unfair advantages over other folks, right? Because if you have an iPhone 12 versus an iPhone 6, that's a different story, right? We're not going to be taking over the world with an iPhone 12 anytime soon. But when it comes to, this whole nother level of some human beings are just going to be walking around, be able to control their stuff with their mind. And it's still a very small level, but think about that. Some people can, some people can't. So how does that turn equitable? I think one last thoughts to hear, any last thoughts about feasibility before we move on are, it's kind of curious that Neuralink, they expect it to be able to help with such a wide variety of conditions. Because one of the issues that's arisen is we are still very barely understanding, and we talked about this a little bit, right, of how brain functioning works, and especially when you think about diseases. Up until recent years, we did not understand the full kind of basis of what anxiety looks like, and we still are understanding it. So to think about, we're going to use tech to solve this without even a full understanding of what anxiety looks like in the clinical setting and medical setting is odd. We don't know if it can fully kind of capture the full range of the condition and the different aspects of it. So something to keep in mind there. Since the video was lagging, we're not going to go through this, but I think that part about us talking with the anxiety and how we can really try to, go on, come on now. Let's see, do I need to, there we go. With kind of addressing not only the full range of human behaviors, but also when they become, when humans are facing diseased conditions, illnesses, mental health issues, treating that as a whole other level. So with that being said, Neuralink is pushing the boundaries, right? I think it's super cool personally. I'm excited to see where it goes, and I have a lot of reservations as well. And we can take a super quick 1 or 2 minute break here. Get up, get some water, stretch your legs. But in the meantime, if you'd like to jot down any thoughts about it in the chat, feel free to go about doing so. Dexter says, I don't believe it'll be equitable for a while, at least initially. I imagine it to be very expensive, but that's sort of how the world works. By the rich buying it, companies can continue to improve the product, bringing price down. Yeah, definitely a lot of I don't have a strong econ background, but definitely thinking about the same route that I think a lot of startup products go is probably one of the routes that Neuralink is going to go through too. Yeah. And it might be interesting, especially because Musk has such a large platform, to see how that goes. If we are developing the solution at the same time as trying to figure out how anxiety is represented in the brain, when we do it, figure it out, Neuralink will be ready to go. Just, yeah, divide and conquer, that's also true. Kind of simultaneously going in the same pace to see if maybe one or the other could come up with a solution earlier, and it would benefit everyone in the end, be useful, helpful. Clive says, I think Neuralink can be a valuable tool for understanding these poorly understood psychological areas, though, as long as participants have informed consent. We don't currently have a direct understanding of how brains work at the medium scale between the level of individual neurons and the level of entire lobes. That's absolutely true. That's such a good point. And this is something we didn't really touch upon, but there's so many different levels itself built in the brain in terms of starting from the neuronal level to but patterns of neurons, how that works, these neural networks, and then going up all the way to these larger lobes. Within the lobes themselves have interactions with one another. The lobes themselves have interactions with sensory motor cortexes, for instance, at the intersection of motor and sensory control, all of that. There's still a lot. There's still a lot with the brain. That's a really good point, Clive. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm gonna get some water real quick. My voice is drying up. All right. Let's keep going along. Here are some other examples of innovation outside of Neuralink, just to kind of give you an idea of what other work is going on in the field, because it's not definitely just implantations. There's a lot of other means as well. So deep brain stimulation is one method in which this is surgical implantation, though. 2 electrodes are kind of, I believe it's 2, not a neurosurgeon. So electrodes are implanted into the brain to specifically stimulate different areas such as it's area called substantia nigra, basal ganglia. So it stimulates these areas of the brain, and it helps with regulating symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And so what Parkinson's disease symptoms may be are motor deficits, such as tremors. So you might see kind of uncontrollable shaking in the limbs, difficulty walking. And DBS has been shown to improve symptoms. So most Parkinson's patients who go through this treatment are able to, function, feed themselves, gain a sense of independence, a bit of empowerment in that way. Prosthetics that feel pain. This is kind of odd to think about, but pain is actually important, right? If someone has a arm prosthetic and they're sitting too close to a fire and they don't realize that their arm is quite literally right next to the fire and it's dangerous because they can't feel pain, then that's not really, great. So scientists are trying to design these prosthetics that can actually feel pain. They can sense pain and transmit that. Super cool to think about, artificially kind of engineering pain. Neurostimulation and physical therapy in combination is something that's been in the works to try to support individuals with overcoming paralysis. And last but not least, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list, there's many other examples out there, is neurofeedback training for children with ADHD. So oftentimes they're kind of asked to play this game, and what the game in the middle of it is, what's going on is their brain waves, different patterns of brain waves are being recorded. So there's all these different levels like beta, theta waves, and etc. And so these clinicians are trying to be able to measure those brain waves and see how they can use those to understand how to best help these children with ADHD. So a lot of different examples and a lot of different conditions, age groups, and purposes. So you might see that a lot of these especially tend to intersect with the clinical setting. But again, like I said, it's not an exhaustive list by any means. There's a lot of different intersections as well. So next part, coming to a little bit of a level more close to our current experiences as students, the process of ideation. So there are all these big advancements going on out there. And the big question is, how can we be involved in this ideation of, well, how do we go about brainstorming and creating these projects and products and technologies? And where do we exactly start? And I kind of wanted to present some core values to keep in mind here in terms of not just our work ethic in terms of working in terms of internships in neurotech or et cetera, or building our own principles and more, is the idea of integrity, impact, teamwork, courage, thoughtfulness, and resilience. So impact, we're thinking about who are the individuals that are going to be benefiting from this work. I gave you some examples about the clinical setting could help in alleviating any symptoms, gaining the sense of independence for patients. and providing them better therapeutic options, for example, when it comes to kind of the courage to go about doing so. Let's imagine, 10 years ago, maybe anxiety was still being figured out in the works in terms of how its underpinnings in the brain are looking like. And obviously someone took the starting step, whether it was a clinician or an individual in tech or a scientist, to go out and focus on that specifically, right? Even Neuralink in itself could be thought of as a courageous venture out, because it's challenging the norms, and that's one of the big things to keep in mind in terms of neurotech, especially because we don't know a lot, so we have to go push those bounds, right? Interdisciplinary STEM, the overall arching theme in terms of you're pushing the bounds to try to create something, bring something together that is novel, that is new, and that hasn't really been focused on before, but needs to be focused on. Now, there's also the idea of thoughtfulness, right? You need to be a considerate human being. You need to have empathy, and this may go as a little bit of common sense, but some folks, may go into looking at these projects and work as sort of with ill intentions, looking at fame because there's so much in the news or et cetera. And I think it's important to keep in mind at the end of the day that it's obviously a process that comes with a lot of hurdles along the way. That's why you need resilience, right? And you also need integrity in terms of the process of approval, for example, FDA approval and et cetera. It takes so much time. And at every step of the way, you do need to be very clear in terms of the work that you're doing, very transparent is something that we need, especially because we're working with, merging the human brain with technology, and there's a lot of different issues that come up in terms of ethics as well. So being very transparent, not only to ourselves, but also to our, our audience, approval procedures, et cetera, is super important. And last but not least, I think something that may be a little bit understated at times, teamwork makes the dream work. Whether you're at hackathon, like Hack the North, or working in internships, working in classes, et cetera, it's super amazing to be involved in these teams, especially because they have so many individuals from different backgrounds coming in. I think even in, no, Clive, it's perfectly okay timing, thank you. Even in our little call today, right? We all come from different backgrounds. I mentioned I'm a medical humanities major. I don't have the strongest tech background, right? But I think bring a little bit of med hum to the table. I think we have a UX design student, if I remember correctly. Bring that to the table. Neurotech folks bring that to the table. Our statistics major in the room brings that to the table. Everyone brings something to the table. And since Clive brought up the topic of Neuralink, for instance, they do have a lot of openings, right, to join their team. They have a lot of more capacity for internships, et cetera. SpaceX, ooh. One of the big things I was noticing when I was scrolling through the careers page in Neuralink the other day, where I was doing a little bit of research for this, was that there's a really wide variety of individuals that roles are open for, from electrical engineers to surgical technicians to neuroanatomists and pathologists and animal care technicians. There's so many people on these teams. Software engineering, everyone's in the team. So internships are definitely one means of kind of getting that exposure in those bigger team settings as well. And of course, we're at a hackathon right now, so I think that's pretty clear in terms of these are really great ways to think about integrating principles, even at the starting level, into your work. Now, this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I do want to integrate it here in terms of, I think one of the big kind of fears that we have, and I've personally also, kind of understood this, felt intimidated by it in some ways, is kind of neurotech is big. It's big, right? And as students, I think we're still at a starting level, entry level things. But something to keep in mind is, even if your work is not heavily based in neuroscience, maybe you walk out of this and you're like, neuro is not my thing, right? And that's perfectly okay. But I think regardless if you find yourself at the, working in tech and environmental science, working in tech and other industries as well, it's kind of curious to keep in mind neuro principles in the back of your mind, though. For instance, if you're looking at social psychology techniques, kind of what do people find themselves more drawn to? Consumer psychology, behavioral economics, marketing tactics, all of these really depend on a lot of neuro principles. And that's just, on the visual aspect, how people tend to react to different studies, what are reporting biases in studies, what is the kind of feedback that you're gathering from your audience? All of this has its base in neuroscience in some principle or way. So definitely, keep your keep your mind open in terms of how you can visualize those own principles in your own work, even if you don't find yourself heavily in neuro. So as for next steps quickly, because yes, Clive, that would be really, really cool if you could talk about it. So we shall do so very quickly. We'll wrap up. So coursework, when it comes to coursework, we mentioned earlier those classes when in terms of CS department courses may not be more neuro, etc. I think definitely trying to push outside of your major, even to explore some courses. Not all colleges, of course, have the same patterns, but for instance, you can do some sort of specialization within your major itself if you have that option, or just take some courses that fulfill your requirements but are a little bit more further removed, that you find interesting. Join any clubs on campus. Startup culture is really big at a lot of universities, so oftentimes a lot of more neuropsych-based, mental health-based startups too, especially, are on the rise. So it's really exciting to be able to go explore that. Internships, of course, Clive just mentioned Neuralink. There's a lot of also smaller scale startups that accept interns for the summer if you bring some sort of tangible skills to the table. And overall, at the end of the day, there's a lot of options. So interdisciplinary career paths, we're going to skim through this really quick. Keep thinking about how you can find yourself pursuing these intersections in the future, whether it be bioinformatics, computational linguistics, cog sci, computational social sci. There's a lot of data that's out there to be worked with. There's a lot of biological, tech side, social side data, AI, design, machine learning, so many different analytical positions, data science positions, philosophy side positions too, software, everything. So definitely, and these slides are going to be accessible through the hack pack and the syllabus afterwards too. So don't worry, since we're rushing through them, this is all there for you. So at the end of the day, keep your mind open, very much open. And if you guys have any questions in the chat right now, and I think, Clive, are you able to request to join, and maybe you can share your audio? Moderation panel. I think I just clicked yes to add.
Does that work?
Hey. Yes, we can hear you.
Cool. Should I talk about that?
Go ahead, by all means.
I guess.
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I don't know. I'm not qualified to really say that much, but
Student.
I guess the general theme among Elon companies is that you really need to be better than anyone else at one particular thing, and so the way you demonstrate that technically is by like building projects or by like really showing repeatedly that you have a really, really sharp focus on one particular thing, rather than just like on the entire field. And so they're looking for basically people who can teach them stuff that they don't know already. They have a lot of really smart people there. So that's difficult, but it's possible, even as an undergrad.
For sure, yeah. I think one of the interesting things about being on very broad teams or everyone from different experience levels and kind of fields of interest comes in is like, at times you're like, it seems like you're the point of representative for like your little niche field, and you bring like a lot of expertise in that way to the team. But yeah, you get started somewhere, so might as well start building on that. Yeah.
I recommend joining design teams. Wink, wink.
Yeah, I wish I had design skills, but I do not.
I think you can, like, it's not just like design, but there's like basically every variety of building something cool exists in some way, in some kind of student club somewhere. You just need to go find it.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, even starting within our individual schools can be a good point, right? Because I'm definitely on a beginner level in tech. And I think like getting involved with student organizations on campus, for instance, has been really great to kind of be able to pursue that on a smaller scale without fear of like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? So I definitely agree. I think it's a great kind of, I might look into getting involved in design on campus. Maybe this is my little spark from today.
Do it.
Yes, I'm in.
You can also just look at the job descriptions and like look up all the words and figure out what those are and make progress towards those. If Neuralink really is your goal.
Yeah. I also just want to put it out there that Neuralink is like definitely very cool and very big. But there's also a lot of other ones out there. I think especially in like the mental health tech startup realm, there's so many out there. And a lot of student-led startups as well that are trying to, get involved earlier on. So, hey, keep looking out there. Just keep your doors open.
Yeah, there actually are multiple mental health related startups at Waterloo. It's super cool to see.
Yeah, I think I also I included a few links on the. I keep forgetting I think it was the Hack Pack, just for examples of kind of some top companies, startups, etc., that are working on innovations that are really in the news, really big. So if that's kind of a helpful starting point for anyone, it was just a couple of news articles that I came across and I thought it'd be cool to share. So Google is your best friend. Just want to put that out there. Clive said here that if you see any descriptions and you're like, I have no clue what that is, looking it up and just going from there in Google is even like a starting point. So never underestimate the power of your search engine.
Yeah, that's really great advice. Also, just to add a little bit to that, a lot of professors are always down to have like volunteer research assistants. So if there's a professor at the school you're going to who does some really cool stuff, you can always send them an email and see if they'll let you in on their team.
True.
Yeah. I think a lot of
learn a lot of new things.
Yeah, I've also seen like there's definitely been an increase in kind of having folks of diverse backgrounds come in, especially in a lot of kind of maker spaces, connected labs. They have some more like hands-on building things as well as kind of in the lab building things. Seems like they're super excited in that means. So yeah. Professors, we love professors. They're such great researchers that are very close to us.
Exactly. They're always there to help.
Absolutely.
They're also really, really good at what they do. Like along with the same thing of like being the best in the world at what you do, and then like working with a whole bunch of people who are also in the best in the world at what they do, but those are different things. That's the best kind of team, and you can definitely get that from a research institution because like professors generally are the expert in their field by the time they're tenured or doing research. So just go for it.
Yeah, they've been studying these things like their whole lives, so they have a lot of passion towards it, which I think is number one.
Yeah,
definitely individuals who are more like aware of what the student journey is like and are more like accessible in that way too. Contacting someone and asking for mentorship, definitely a great resource. Wow, we're at time already. That's so sad. It went well. So happy.
It was a really great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining in as well. This is my contact info here. If you want to be in touch afterwards, I'm always super happy to chat and learn more about neurotech as well. I'm always still learning too, right? And if you want to hop on the Discord after with any questions, I'm going to be hanging out until around maybe 10:30 my time. Well, around like a half an hour from now or so, and even later. Yeah. And last but not least, be sure to go check out the Hack Pack and the syllabus. Could be helpful for some later resources as well. Looking into those, next steps, maybe some ideas. If there's any way that I can help connect you with more neuro resources through simply Neuroscience or other means, also happy to chat about that. And last but not least, thank you, Daya and Clive, for being such amazing workshop helpers and also sharing your insight.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Cool.